morning, everyone. I'd like to go ahead and get us started. My name is William Carter. I have the pleasure and privilege of being the Dean of the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and it's really an honor to welcome you all to the inaugural Summer Energy Law and Policy Institute. This event is really exciting. There have been a lot of folks who I'd like to thank who've been involved in bringing it to fruition, which I will do in a moment, but I wanted to thank all of you for being here, for participating, for sharing your knowledge. For those of you who've traveled some distance, our particular thanks. We look forward to your contributions as well. So I've been asked to offer a few brief opening remarks. I was just reminded to make one very important announcement. The wireless network is B Center, all one word, the letter B, Center. Not that you'll be engaged in emailing during a program of this impressiveness, but just in case, it is B Center, and there's no password. Again, I do want to welcome you all. I want to take a moment to thank all of the folks who have made this event possible. One thing I learned very quickly as Dean is that it's very easy to have a good idea, but then someone actually has to do it and make it happen. And that is usually not the Dean. So I do want to take a moment to thank those who have been involved in bringing this event together. First of all are the faculty and staff at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law who really have put in countless hours in bringing this event together. The second is visiting Professor Hannah Wiseman, who is here at the front, has been instrumental. She's an energy law expert and really has a wonderful knowledge of the scope of the field of energy law, and her enthusiasm and diligence have really been instrumental in making this event happen, so my thanks to Hannah as well. The third is Ed Humes, and I don't know where Ed went, has also been incredibly active and engaged in bringing this event together and sharing his expertise and some of his time with us, so my thanks to Ed. Fourth, I do want to take a moment to thank all of our co-sponsors who enthusiastically came on board, both with financial support, but also with their expertise and sharing their time with us. Our co-sponsors for the event are Babst Callan, Buchanan Ingersoll Rooney, the Energy Bar Association, which has contributed also a great deal of the legwork to making this happen, the University of Pittsburgh Center for Energy, EverPower, K&L Gates, the Marcellus Shale Coalition, Reed Smith, Steptoe and Johnson, the Swanson School of Engineering at the University of Pittsburgh, and YPE. All of those partners have been incredibly supportive and enthusiastic about this event, and I do hope that this is just the beginning of the various ways in which we can partner with all of you in the growth and development of this field. I want to take just a moment to share a few brief thoughts and reflections. Although I am not an energy law expert, and indeed I am pretty unburdened by any substantive knowledge whatsoever of the field, I've learned enough to know why it's exciting as a dean of a law school because of the range of the issues that it addresses. Now, of course, the field of energy law in some sense is very old, right? The idea of regulations and policies that relate to the generation of energy is something that this country's been engaged in for hundreds of years, but in some ways as a coherent field, energy law is also quite new. We've always had various regulated industries where we deal with issues of rate making and cost recovery for utilities, but energy law as it stands today, at least as I understand it, cuts across various industries and legal issues that are relevant to energy law and policy. To name just a few of those, energy law, of course, covers regulatory and title issues that are associated with oil and gas drilling. It covers the permitting of natural gas and oil distribution lines and pipelines, as well as liquefied natural gas export terminals. There are issues of eminent domain and cost recovery that are associated with the expansion of electric transmission lines. And of course, there's environmental and governmental regulation that's relevant to all of the above. One of the things that's interesting to me as a teacher and a scholar and a dean in the field of energy law is that cross-cutting nature where the field is one that requires practitioners and business people and academics who are involved in it to be able to work outside of their own individual disciplinary silos. It's a field that seems to me to be by definition somewhat interdisciplinary, which relates to part of our mission at Pitt Law School to ensure that we are training the workforce of tomorrow in the way that law is practiced today, and it has certainly evolved and requires a greater span of knowledge than ever before. The issue of energy law is also one that's about public policy one is about governance, right? When you think about regulations that are relevant to the field of energy law, there's the question of why regulate, when regulate, and who should regulate, right? Various levels of government have a hand in the regulation of the field of energy. The states are often, or at least becoming, the leaders in the field of energy law. They write and implement the standards that govern renewables and various aspects of the oil and gas portfolio. And they also have the primary authority over siting and development as well as infrastructure issues. In some states, I'm told here in Pennsylvania, the municipalities are particularly active as well, so you have another layer of government regulation. And the federal government, of course, has some key authority over areas that are relevant to the development of the energy portfolio as well. It's particularly interesting to think about the continued interaction of those various layers of government, because not only may they have different interests from the business and legal community, but each layer of government may have different interests from one another, and that raises some particularly interesting and knotty questions for those of us who are interested in it as public policy. For me, as the Dean of Pitt Law, energy law is clearly one of our key strategic priorities for advancing the law school, and it makes perfect sense, both because of the strengths that exist at the law school that we intend to further build, the strengths that exist within the University of Pittsburgh and the various units that have a hand in the field of energy and energy development, but also being part of this region, being located where we are. The Pittsburgh region really is a leader, national and global leader in the field of energy development. Indeed, I just saw a news story from the National Law Journal that said the Pittsburgh region is among the top 5 regions in the country for the growth of lawyers, due largely to the development of energy, not solely the Marcellus Shale, but primarily the Marcellus Shale. I think that we, that is the law school, the university, and this region are well positioned to be the leaders in this field. You will have an opportunity today to dialogue about these important policy, legal, and business issues, and I hope to join you for as much of the dialogue as possible. Before I step out of the way and get to the program, I do want to just encourage those of you who have come out of town to spend a little time getting to know the city. I'm still relatively new here, and I continue to be impressed every day, by the region, by our neighborhoods, by our business and legal community, by our bench and bar. And I would say, as someone who's lived and practiced in a variety of areas, I would put our legal and business community up against anyone's in the world. We have one of the best bars and benches and business communities that I have ever seen. So I would encourage you, if this is your first time in the Pittsburgh region, to spend some time getting to know us, getting to know the university, and getting to know the people. If you have the opportunity to get out and come up to campus or get into some of the neighborhoods, I think you'll really be impressed, as I have been, with Pittsburgh and the University of Pittsburgh. So again, let me extend my thanks to all of you for coming. Let me share my excitement at this event. Let me again thank all of our co-sponsors and those who have participated in bringing this event to fruition, and I really look forward to it. I hope that this is not only the inaugural iteration of this event, but is the first of many to come. So again, my sincere thanks, and enjoy the program.
Good morning, my name is Celia Franklin, and I'm an associate at Buchanan Ingersoll & Rooney, and I'll be the moderator for the first panel today, which is titled Policies, Regulations, and Technologies Driving a Changing Energy Economy. I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Gregory Reed. Dr. Gregory Reed is the director of the Electric Power Initiative in the Swanson School of Engineering at the University of Pittsburgh. He's also the associate director of the University Center for Energy and associate professor of electric power engineering in the Swanson School's Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. Dr. Reed is also the director and technical lead of the Grid Technologies Collaborative for the U.S. Department of Energy's National Energy Technology Laboratory and an inaugural member of the National Academies of Science and Engineering's Energy Ambassador Program. Dr. Reed has over 27 years of combined industry and academic experience in the electric power and energy sector, including positions in engineering, research and development, and executive management throughout his career with Con Ed of New York, ABB Incorporated, and Mitsubishi Electronic Corporation. Dr. Reed earned his PhD in electric power engineering from the University of Pittsburgh, his master's in engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and his Bachelor of Science from Gannon University. Dr. Reed?
Thank you, Celia. Good morning, everyone. It's certainly a privilege to be here, and I'd also like to thank Dean and Hannah for inviting me to participate with you all this morning. I think this is a very timely conference in terms of energy development and all that is happening in the energy sector, as the Dean pointed out, especially here in this region. And what I'd like to touch upon this morning is just a brief overview to kick the conference off on the impact of what really has become a rapidly changing energy economy in the U.S. And especially on how it impacts modern grid optimization and modernization. The title of my talk, as you see here, is probably longer than the talk itself, but it's a complex issue. And I'm gonna start by addressing just a few themes, three main themes essentially. And I think these first two in particular, there are many more people in the room who will have more insights to these topics as the conference go on. But I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about the impact on the modernization and expansion of the electric power grid. And I know there's going to be a panel on that later this afternoon as well, which I'm very excited about. But I do want to address what's happening in terms of the rapidly changing resource portfolio for electricity generation in particular. I'm going to really focus my discussion this morning on the electricity side of the energy sector, the challenges that are associated with the trends in the future projections in the energy mix, and in particular, the changing location of energy resources and electricity generation locations, and how that impacts power system planning and operations, and then get into more details about some of the solutions that we're looking at technologically from a grid perspective. So this is probably something most of you are already familiar with, the fact that we have, in 3 years, gone from an electricity generation mix that consisted of 50% fossil resources from coal to last year only 37%. That's a dramatic shift. Natural gas went from 18 or 19% up to 30%. And in the middle of all this, renewables, non-hydro renewables continue to grow. And so there's a lot of implications with this, not only again from a business point of view, from a policy and regulation point of view, but certainly from a grid operations point of view. One other chart to show in this area is the projections. So these are projections out to 2040 by the U.S. Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration. And as you can see, what they're projecting out to 2040 has already happened today. So one of the questions I think we have to start asking ourselves is, you know, where do we go from here if this is what was supposed to happen in 2040? Obviously, things are changing much more rapidly than we ever would have anticipated. So the challenges in all of this on the power grid are numerous. First of all, we already have continued growth overall in electricity demand. This is something that will continue to go up as we grow as a nation. For many, many years now, actually going on decades, we've continued to not invest in transmission as much as we should have, especially in new expansion. And we're facing problems and have faced problems with transmission congestion. We're dealing with a legacy old system, a legacy system that's basically its design dates back over a century. We're still working on technologies that George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison would be very familiar with if they walked into any of our electrical substations today. But the trend that's really disturbing and that's really causing a lot of difficulty for electric utilities and their operations is the rapid decommissioning of many fossil plants that are near the load. So we don't just lose the megawatts, and I know this is not necessarily a technical audience per se, but there's another aspect of power called megavars. And VARs are required for voltage support, and without voltage support we can't deliver electricity effectively. When we lose power plants, we don't just lose the megawatts, which we can replace in many cases with gas generation and gas turbines and even forms of renewables, but we lose the VARs. that are critical. So we have to provide solutions to replace those. So this rapidly changing generation resource mix and the change of plant locations, many of them coming from more remote locations and near load centers, is something that we're facing on a day-to-day basis in the industry. You add to that the increased penetration of renewable generation, which really actually makes it difficult, not just from a location point of view, but something that we're trying to get our hands around and do better with, which is how to deal with the intermittent nature of renewable resources. It's very, very hard to dispatch generation resources that we don't know when and where we're going to have them. So base load is critical. One of the good things I will say about the changing mix with this shift from coal to natural gas, two different forms of fossil, is at least we do keep a good part of our base, which is important. But another thing that's happening that most people probably aren't even aware of at all is really a change that's happening more at the consumer level, at the end-use level. Traditionally, power systems were designed and operated for centralized generation in large amounts, delivered one way over a bulk transmission system in large amounts, and then distributed out to the consumers. It's always been a one-way flow, and it's predominated on an AC distribution network, alternating current. Again, that was developed, over a century ago. Today, things are very different. More and more distributed resources are coming online at the commercial, industrial, and even the consumer level. So this is at the utility distribution level where we haven't had a lot of resources to work with. So this is very, very new, and we're learning and trying to figure out how to deal with this in a better way. In addition, our loads are changing from AC loads to DC loads. Look around your home or your business or even this room that we're in. Most of the things that we're using, the camera back there that's connected up to a computer, the computer here, the projector, much of what you'll see in your homes and offices, your television screens, all of your home electronics, business electronics, actually run on low voltage DC power. So we have a little bit of a mismatch between how we supply electricity and today in how we use it. So we carry around these converters in our briefcase. Many of the converters are embedded into the technology. You don't even see it. And we really only need a few volts of DC. Yet every day we continue to plug things into, again, a legacy system of 120 volts AC. Most things don't need 120 volts AC anymore. So we have some challenges to deal with, from the grid all the way down to where we use electricity. Getting back up to the grid for a minute, if you look at a chart of our existing power plants in the U.S., and this is already changing. This dates back, this chart that I have, to 2009, 2010, but it's pretty much still relevant. You see where all of our power plants are, and you notice that the concentrations of them are where you'd expect them, near where we live, where our major urban centers are here in the country, near the load centers. What's beginning to happen, though, is as we decommission more and more of these near-load fossil facilities, is more of these resources are being remotely located. And we'll talk about what's going on in parts of the country where we don't see a whole lot of existing infrastructure. And I'll do that right now, which is in terms of where our highest penetrations of renewable energy capabilities are. If I look at the highest penetrations of wind, and when we talk about it on where can I get the gigawatts of power, not just a few megawatts or a few hundred, but the really high penetrations. I'm in the Midwest states. Okay, we don't have a whole lot of population or infrastructure here in terms of delivery and other aspects to get to high penetrations to where we use it. Even along the coast, when we look at offshore wind, which we haven't done a lot of yet in this country, it's not just a couple hundred yards offshore. It's many miles offshore. And so there's no undersea infrastructure that exists today to deliver offshore wind. So it's not just a matter of putting wind platforms out in the ocean, it's a matter of moving that energy many miles to get it onshore. All right? And then if you look also at the highest penetrations of solar, they tend to be in a part of the country where we don't have a lot of infrastructure or population. And let's add to that one of the latest developments, and very exciting around here, which is the shale gas plays. Again, many of them, as you look out here into Western Canada, other parts of the Midwest, in the western regions, again, in areas where we don't have a lot of delivery infrastructure or population center. Now, presents an opportunity that I'll talk about a little bit later for our region, where the Marcellus shale gas play is in a very populated part of the country, and one that I believe we can take more advantage of than just extracting the resource itself. But obviously, this has been one of the biggest game changers in the industry that's taken place now. Now, if I show some more maps of the U.S., let's overlay some of this with the U.S. bulk transmission grid. Okay, it looks a lot like the map of the power plants, where I have a majority of my grid concentration in the eastern interconnect parts of Texas and out west. Very little where these renewable resources are, where many of the shale gas opportunity plays are, and again, where we're starting to move more and more of our resources. So if I look at those two together, you can sort of see how that looks. So if you get outside the Northeast region, it's really the place where we have the most dense population and the densest transmission infrastructure. As we move further and further away from these population centers, our infrastructure is very stringy, if I could use a term. And again, many of the fossil plants that are being decommissioned are in these populated areas, and they provide deficiencies for us as we decommission them in terms of energy supply. So if you look at the two maps together, obviously today they're very well aligned. But things are changing. And if I can talk about it just for a second in the context of just renewable energy alone, the DOE, various factions of the DFE have talked about, going back, even almost a decade now, about the importance of transmission build-out. If we're going to really capture the capacity and potential and capability of renewable resources in this country, we're not going to be able to do it without new transmission infrastructure. And for the past quarter century, we have built little to no transmission infrastructure, something that continues to be problematic today. In fact, there was a study that was originally done in 2006, redone in 2009, and there were no changes, by the way, over that period, that showed new transmission that would need to be built to reach the portfolio standards that many of the states are looking at to increase the amount of wind generation into the bulk transmission system. I can tell you that other than down here in Texas through the CREZ project with ERCOT, almost none of this have been built. So if we have done this study again in 2012, 3 years later, we'd have a map that still looks the same. This is the new transmission that we need to build. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, again, in terms of a strategy. One of the ways that we really need to think about how we expand transmission is twofold. One is, how do we make better use of the existing AC infrastructure that's out there? Okay, there is a lot of inefficiency, and we can utilize the transmission capabilities more than we do today. But there's also new technologies that we really haven't really taken advantage of, that we've developed over the last several decades in the electric power technology development area, particularly around power electronics. Most of what you carry, again, in your briefcase, on your hip, everything that you use is based on power electronics capabilities. With the advent of the transistor back in the late 60s, early 70s, it really changed our lives and how we interact with technology. We're starting to bring those capabilities up into the power grid as well. And the advancement of these technologies are very important in terms of how we need to implement them as, again, we modernize the grid and begin to look at how we're going to expand it. I talked a little bit before about how the nature of how we use electricity is changing. So really the nature of how we deliver electricity has to change as well if we're going to make it more efficient. And it's not just at the consumer level. When you start to look at the supply level, many of the new resources that we're looking at developing, including solar, are inherently a DC resource to begin with also. So this legacy of an AC infrastructure for transmission and power delivery is something that we really need to start to think about more critically at a national level so that we can have a better match, again, of supply and demand. Add to that the development of smart grid capabilities, how consumers and participants in the markets can now communicate more effectively into the grid and into the energy resource end of it. So integrating those concepts for enhanced control and automation and communication, automation and security, they do two things. One, they empower the consumer and make the consumer a greater participant in the markets. But it also enables us to be able to diagnose and monitor what's going on in the markets much, much better as an industry. So this is where some of these advanced technologies come into play. And as we look at advancing the grid, again, I mentioned this a little bit ago, we have different ways to do it. One is to make better utilization of the existing infrastructure, and we have technologies that are known as flexible AC transmission systems that improve the performance of AC systems, and they support this VAR deficiency that I talked about, especially as we look at near load center decommissioning of power plants. FACS technologies have been around for about 40 years now. We've implemented them all over the world very successfully, although right now, within the last 5 years, we're in an unprecedented period of applications for this technology. I would say that 2 out of every 3 projects right now in the U.S. For a FACS application is being driven and justified by the decommissioning of fossil plants near load centers. But as we look beyond that, and we look beyond just how do we solve the day-to-day problems and year-to-year problems that we're facing, and we look further out into a future of one, again, with these continued changes in energy portfolio and generation mixes, we need to look at a strategy that enhances and expands our transmission capacity and capability. And I think we need to look at this using high voltage DC solutions. It's a better match to, again, resources and loads, and it provides a lot of benefits over the legacy AC networks and technologies, which I'll talk about in a minute. And again, transmission is up at the bulk level. This is where we take the big centralized generation, the many, many gigawatts, and bring it down near our load centers and then distribute it to our homes and businesses and factories. In between there, in that distribution network, we literally have in this country almost 6 million miles of infrastructure. It's all old AC equipment, and it's being upgraded in many cases as transformers and other equipment that's out there over 40 and 50 years of useful life begin to fail. We replace it in kind right now. So we have to start to look at a future that's even further out, where we have this match of a medium voltage DC infrastructure, again, one at the end use level that's a better connection between our grid and our end use supply and demand. It really starts to set up a new age war of the currents, AC versus DC. And I see some smiles out in the audience. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this is really the history of my life and what me and my students and colleagues think about a lot. You know, let's go back over 100 years to Westinghouse and Tesla and Edison, and why did they come up with AC to begin with? And why are we rethinking all of this today? And of course, many of the reasons are what I've already talked about. So we're in this new age war of the currents, which is actually quite exciting, but it's because it's necessitated. And part of what necessitates it is this need to reinvest in transmission. You know, transmission has always been a regulated business, and up until the mid-70s, you know, during sort of our golden age in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we built out the majority of our bulk transmission capability and infrastructure here in the United States. But from the oil embargo until really the 21st century, we continued to underinvest in R&D, in infrastructure, in technology, even in human capital. There's a big talent gap that has developed in the power industry in terms of technical workforce capabilities. And so we need to fill all of this. What we've seen in the last 6 to 7 years is a big increase in transmission investment, but one that I think really needs to be enhanced even more if we're going to meet some national objectives. One of the concepts of many that we like to talk about is looking to a future of investment in transmission that could perhaps be something that looks a lot like our interstate system. When you think of what we did in this country with the highways, we built the interstate system out very strategically so that we could move trucks and cars and buses and transportation in a very efficient manner. We never really did that with the grid, to be quite honest. Our grid was developed really in piecemeal. If I could use the analogy of the highway system, it was like building, you know, our own infrastructure city by city and then tying those cities together by 2-lane highways. Well, we never upgraded the 2-lane highways. We never put those interstates and turnpikes in for the transmission grid. There are concepts today that we can do this from a national perspective. And if we're going to do it and do it effectively, we need to follow the example of others that are doing it ahead of us right now. China is one. Germany has plans now as they look at a rapidly changing generation portfolio of a large build-out of supergrids involving high-voltage DC capabilities interconnected into our existing AC network. So it looks a lot like the interstate highway system. And I know one of the impediments to building transmission, of course, is not in my backyard and siting. And of course, nobody wants to see transmission facilities. One of the advantages of DC over AC is it's much cheaper to go underground, and I think that's something we need to start to learn more about and to understand in terms of the costs associated with underground infrastructure versus overhead. And it's not just a matter of costs and not in my backyard, but when you look at the heightened amount of natural disasters that we've had in this country and around the world in recent years, it wreaks havoc on our overhead electric power systems. And the electricity goes out, we have blackouts at every hurricane, and we can't even get to restoration efforts until we have the infrastructure back in place. So the HVDC technologies, I list here a number of advantages of them. You know, one of the big ones is that they can carry a lot more capability over a given corridor than AC solutions, and they offer a solution to a national strategy. There are some other things here as well, again, to talk about. Just to show a couple of pictures of some of this technology, there's a lot of investment involved. And I think that's another opportunity for us, again, to start to spark private investment and capital into this sector is merchant transmission projects. When you look at a large HVDC converter station, one that might be several thousand megawatts, it's in the order of $500 million of investment. So there's a lot of capital to be brought to it. And it's important for us here in the Pittsburgh region. Dean Carter already talked about our role here, the leadership role that Pittsburgh plays, and it's well beyond what we do with policy and the Marcellus Shale. We have a heritage here that goes back, again, over 100 years from the Westinghouse legacy that exists in companies like Eaton Corporation and Mitsubishi Electric and others, where we develop the technologies, we do the R&D around this critical technology for power delivery. And so I think it presents a lot of opportunities for those of us who are at this conference. I'm obviously on the engineering and technology side. Most of you are on the legal side, the policy side. I think it's about time that our industry, and I think we can play a leadership role here in Pittsburgh, begins to collaborate more in these sectors. I think the policymakers and the lawyers need to have the engineers and the technologists at the table more often in their discussions, and vice versa, so we can understand each other much, much better to develop the thoughtful and smart solutions to the challenges that we have ahead. I think there's tremendous potential for our region, again, not just in terms of the energy extraction and the resource development, but in terms of the technology development, manufacturing, the job creation, the economic development, and the partnership that we can bring here to the region. I also think, of course, as a professor, being with students every day, that this sector in this field and what we have ahead of us is tremendously exciting for young Americans and for our future of leadership. So with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to panel questions later. Thank you very much. This is David's here. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. As a new lawyer, I agree. It is very exciting, the opportunities we have here. Our next speaker today is Dr. David Spence. Dr. Spence is a professor of law, politics, and regulation at the University of Texas at Austin's McCombs School of Business. Professor Spence teaches courses on energy regulation, environmental regulation, business government relations, corporate social responsibility, and stakeholder relations. Before coming to academia, Professor Spence was a practicing attorney representing public utilities and energy companies in connection with a wide variety of environmental and energy regulatory matters. He has considerable experience providing executive education training in the field of corporate social responsibility and stakeholder relations for a wide variety of energy and other companies, including Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil, Petrobras, the BCG Group, Chicago Bridge and Iron, Sinopec, and many others. In addition to his work at the University of Texas, Professor Spence has taught at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment, Vanderbilt Law School, Cornell Law School, University of Santa Barbara's Bren School of Environment, and Harvard Law School. Professor Spence earned his PhD in political science from Duke University and his JD from the University of North Carolina.
Thanks very much. Let me just get situated here. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. First of all, I want to thank the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, Dean Carter, and Hannah Weissman for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about energy issues. And what I thought I'd do, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of energy law and challenges to energy laws, litigation, that sort of thing later in the conference. So what I thought I'd do in this first opportunity to speak here is talk a little bit about the political debate over energy issues in general, and that the context, the political context in which a lot of the energy fights we're going to talk about today exists. And this also has the added side benefit for me of giving me a chance to rant about my pet peeves about that debate. So indulge me if you will, but I think it's sometimes helpful, and I certainly tell my students this, it's sometimes helpful, I think, to understand how politics drives some of the policies we end up with. And so I want to talk a little bit about that topic. And generally, I want to make 3 points. A lot of our policy problems, of course, involve the intersection of regulation and markets, right? And disagreements over where to draw the line on regulation. And we've heard a little bit about this morning already about transmission siting. That's a perfect example of one of those types of situations. The solutions there are going to have to involve action by politicians. And so the political debate is going to color what solutions we get, what changes in the law we get. Second, that when people talk in the political arena about these issues, they often use very stylized versions of regulation or very stylized versions of markets. I'm always struck by how much more mature and sober and detailed and honest discussions of energy policy issues are at conferences like this compared with what you see out in the world in sort of public political discussions of energy policy issues. And that could, up here you have a lot of discussion over hydraulic fracturing. I'm sure you've sort of seen that as an example of what I'm talking about. You see it with siting of pipelines and siting of transmission lines. And right now you may be aware of the fact that there's an organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council trying to repeal renewable portfolio standards at the states all over the country. Those debates get very heated as well, and so the discussion tends to be involved in these sort of very stylized, sort of ideological purity kinds of set in that sort of setting. That's not helpful, I don't think. And so I want to talk about why we have this sort of these centrifugal forces in the energy policy debate, and then make a plea for, the kind of more sober discussion that we see in conferences like this. Okay. Almost every time I talk about anything related to energy policy, I use this figure. Many of you have probably seen it before. It comes from the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. They do this every year. They produce a figure that shows the flow of energy through the American economy. And on the left-hand side are the primary energy sources. On the right-hand side are the end uses. And you get it's a nice, for those of us who are sort of visual learners, it's a nice way to sort of get a sense of where and how we use energy. And one of the things that's helpful for is to show us, if you have an ideal version of where what you'd like the energy mix to look like, it gives you a sense of how far you are from that mix right now. So if you think that we can rely on, 70% renewables, for example, you can see that we have a long way to go to get there. If you'd like to see us no longer rely on coal as an energy source, you can see we have a long way to go to get to that. Coal is the black figure there that heads up into the electricity generation, mostly into the electricity generation bar. So it's a good way of sort of keeping us grounded in reality. I think most people in these debates over the intersection of regulation and markets, most people are, I think, in their heart of hearts, somewhere in the middle, right? You realize that we want energy in a usable form when we need it, but we'd also like it to be as environmentally not intensive. Is that a word? We'd like it to be do as little environmental harm as possible. Within those constraints, we'd like our energy use to be more efficient if we can get it there. We'd like to promote innovation. We'd like least cost energy. We want all these things at the same time. The disagreements are over how to strike those balances and how to get to where we want to get to. So so what I'd like to do is take a couple of sets of issues and talk about how how the debate over these issues in the public arena is different from in the private arena, and why we see this polarization. And the two sets of issues really will relate to the notion of externalities. Economists would call them environmental externalities, and how we control pollution. So this is an age-old problem in energy policy debates, right? Air pollution from coal combustion, for example, is particularly harmful. And these bullets that you see, the first couple of bullets there with all the acronyms in them, many of you will recognize those acronyms as various recent rules that the EPA has promulgated or is promulgating that would limit pollution from coal combustion of coal-fired power plants. We also have these other issues that I've already talked about, RPS battles in the states, shale gas production, fracking. These are all examples of policy debates that involve externalities regulation, regulating because the market doesn't, according to sort of an economic view of things, the market doesn't price pollution into the cost of the product, and pollution is a cost that is instead imposed on society. So these rules are a response to that concern. And the intense debate, I don't know if it's quite as intense here as it is in my home state of Texas, where our governor is constantly talking about the EPA's war on Texas. More generally, it's often referred to as the war on coal. The debate can get quite heated about where that balance ought to be struck. The other sort of set of issues that involve this same sort of regulation versus markets question relates to what we now know as organized electricity markets or competitive electricity markets. You have one here in the PJM region, we have one in Texas, in the ERCOT region, and there are several others throughout the country. There are debates there about how much these markets ought to be regulated and how they ought to be regulated. And so, just this week we saw the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission announce a couple of gigantic fines, one against JP Morgan, another against Barclays Bank, over trading in the California electricity market. And so we see these are still sort of current issues. We're talking about regulating competition now, not regulating externalities, but regulating competition to ensure that it's fair, to ensure that there's not what we would think of as antitrust law violations going on in these various markets. And so these are sort of the two major areas of regulation that we see in which we see these sorts of fights. And part of the problem, part of the reason why we have this ideological, these centrifugal forces in markets and this polarization of the debate is because we have polarized debate in all of our politics, right? There are political scientists who measure they try to measure the ideological disposition of individuals, members of Congress, over the entire range of our history, of Congress's history. In fact, one of the most prominent ones is just down the road here at Carnegie Mellon, a guy named Keith Poole. Some of you may be familiar with him. And over that time of measuring the ideology on a left-right dimension, liberal-conservative dimension, over the history of Congress, they've shown, the people who do this, that the Congress has become much, much more polarized. This probably won't shock anyone, but it might confirm your sense that Congress two parties have become much farther apart ideologically than they ever have been in our lifetimes, anyone in this room's lifetime. There are far fewer moderates in Congress, the kind of people that used to be able to build bridges across party lines. And, and when that happens, winning or losing becomes a very high-stakes affair for the people involved. And so that contributes to the polarization of debate. It essentially allows us to more easily demonize the other side. And we see this a lot in energy debates. So if we think about it, this is what I call naive markets, naive view of markets, and a naive view of regulation. So if you take the sort of pro-market people and you sort of give an example of how they talk about markets and opposing regulation in what I would say is a naive way. Typically, you'll hear the phrase, let's just let the market work. Let's take electricity markets, for example. Let's just let the market work. If we let the market work, this is the Adam Smith argument, we let the market work, then resources will be allocated to their best use. The price signal will tell people when to invest, when not to invest, tell consumers when to buy, when not to buy, and we will have efficiency. Well, obviously, one response to that is we have the externalities problem. We've already talked about that. That's not something that's priced into the market. But in the electricity markets, we also have another set of issues related to investment. In Texas, we have what's, comes closer than almost any other organized market to a let the market work system. We have competitive electricity markets in Texas. We can choose our supplier. The wholesale market has sets a price on a regular basis, very fine increments of time over the course of a day. We don't have any other incentives in our market other than price for people to decide to build or not build new plants. Here in PJM and up in the north, many of the other organized markets, there are incentives, additional incentives built into the market for people to build plants just to have those plants available in case you need them in times of high load and low reserve margins. And in the places where you have these so-called capacity markets, you have more capacity being built. In Texas, we don't have that. We want to let the market work. And now we're facing shortages. We're facing, as we project forward, a lack of sufficient capacity to cover those high peak demand periods. And so the debate over whether to create capacity markets in Texas is characterized in the public anyway by this extreme language. If you don't want to just let the market work, if you want capacity markets, you are a socialist. You are in favor of the nanny state. You are re-regulating. This kind of language. And this is what you see in the public debate because the members of our Public Utility Commission are, appointed by the governor, and they feel a loyalty to the governor, and this is the kind of rhetoric we see. And it's not just in Texas, but we see this in other places as well. Part of the reason we have this, so you have this kind of heated debate to begin with, this polarization, and that gives rise to parties who have an interest in the outcome using that language, rationalizing. Essentially, they're rationalizing sort of what they want to be true, what benefits them to be true, and arguing that as a sort of public benefit. So, for example, if you're a trader for Barclays or J.P. Morgan, and you can make a lot of money over the volatility of electricity prices in a market like Texas, which is likely to be extremely volatile in the near future because of the lack of capacity reserves, then this let the market work, this sort of free market ideology, and those who disagree with me are socialists language, is to your benefit, right? That you can use that language, you can use it instrumentally to get what you want. And this is not necessarily a cynical thing. This can be things, if you study behavioral psychology and you're sort of familiar with the revolution of work in that field, this is something we all do. We all have these cognitive biases that allow us to rationalize what we want to be true to be objectively true in our minds. And so we see that in the debates over how much we should interfere with electricity markets in Texas. I'll get to cultural cognition of risk in a second because I think it fits better in the next example I want to use. So let's talk about naive regulation. Well, I'm backwards, aren't I? Naive regulation is what I want. I have my slides a little bit mixed up here. Sorry. This is my fault, not Hannah's. I changed my slides last night and didn't fix them properly. So let me stay on this slide so I don't confuse you. So let's talk about fracking, for example. How many of you all are involved in debates over hydraulic fracturing in some way or another? Maybe you represent towns or companies or somebody who's involved. So you're familiar with, if you've been involved in any of the debates where a town or in the case of New York, an entire state is considering a moratorium or a ban on fracking, and you get involved in these discussions over whether that's a good idea or not. You then necessarily get involved in, well, what is fracking dangerous? And if you look at the science of fracking, you have a lot of scientists, you have studies coming in all the time. The sort of our understanding of the effects of fracking is being built piece by piece with experience and with study by academics and the government sector as well. You see people using that science in different ways depending upon which side they're on, right? And so a friend of mine at Duke who's working on this says that one of her colleagues who has authored one of the primary studies on whether or not fracking affects groundwater of nearby wells is proud that he's been demonized by both sides. People use these studies instrumentally because we all apparently assimilate new information, including technical information, in a biased way depending upon what our preferences are. So if you work for the industry, you get this guy's study and you see that it shows that no fracking fluids were leaking into nearby wells, and you cite the study as showing that fracking is safe. And if you're on the other side, if you're sort of a NIMBY movement, pardon my language, but most of these movements are local NIMBY movements, opposing fracking, then you look at this study and you see that methane in nearby wells is at a higher concentration than methane nearby to fracking is at a higher concentration than water wells far away from the fracking. And you say this shows that fracking can be an avenue of contamination of methane into water wells. So we do this almost unconsciously. And there's a guy at Yale Law School named Dan Kahan who's got a project called the Cultural Cognition of Risk. That's what this is a reference to here. And he's shown through experiments that we do this not just because of our own predispositions, but also because of how we identify ourselves ideologically, culturally, as sort of what group do we think of ourselves as belonging to. I'm an environmentalist. Let's say I'm an environmentalist. I'm playing a role here now. I am sort of an environmentalist, but I'm also work with industry. So, but let's say I'm an environmentalist, and I've been involved in movements to promote environmental values, and I'm trying to figure out whether fracking is dangerous. I may have lots of my friends at Natural Resources Defense Council or my friends at Sierra Club urging me to reach the conclusion that fracking is in fact a harm, a danger, a hazard. If you've watched Gasland, you sort of get a sense of this point of view. And that cultural definition of myself as an environmentalist or as a Democrat or as a liberal influences how I'm going to interpret all the science that's out there on fracking. When I look at that science now, I'm no longer playing my role. When I look at that science now, to me, it looks quite careful, circumspect, and measured. It doesn't seem to support a conclusion that fracking is inherently dangerous. It doesn't seem to prove that that fracking doesn't do any harm. These are scientists. They have scientific norms. They present their findings in a very careful and limited way, but their findings are not used in the public debate in a careful and limited way. Instead, we have anti-fracking groups, demonizing public officials and others who would support fracking. So anyway, we have these centrifugal forces in debate, and so the question is, what do we do about that? I'm running out of time here, but I think I'm going to make an appeal for comparing risks, a risk regulation point of view. What's missing from all of this is that we don't look at these various risks in a holistic way. This graph shows how, and this is something that the Dean has already mentioned, Dean Reed's already mentioned, and that's the substitution of gas for coal over time in our electric generation mix. And coal has a risk profile as well, right? Gas production has a risk profile. Coal has a risk profile. And as gas substitutes for coal, the environmental risk that we face in total, I think I can comfortably say, or at least I'm comfortable defending it, goes down sharply, right? I mean, coal combustion, according to the National Academy of Sciences, according to health professionals, according to economists, kills people prematurely each year in the tens of thousands. Fracking doesn't do that. Nuclear power doesn't do that. And so if we're going to make these decisions, if we're going to have a policy debate about these decisions, I think we ought to have it in the framework of risk regulation and in a broader framework. I intended to say more about that and to tie it back to the electric markets, but I'm out of time, so I will stop there and be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spence. Is this on?
Oh, I don't think they're on.
Thank you. Just go up there.
You can hear us, right?
There you go.
There we go. Thank you, Dr. Spence. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Hannah?
Start. I'll ask both of my questions for each of you if you can remember them and if you need me to repeat them. So,
Okay.
Professor Spence, I wonder, I assume you think that we should use this more holistic risk-based analysis at the state and federal level, but do you think that we may need more of a comprehensive federal energy policy or some sort of vision moving forward? And then for Dr. Reed, I'm very interested in this suggestion that transmission lines may increasingly move underground due to more extreme weather events as well as NIMBY concerns. And I'm wondering if you know of any estimates about how much more those cost upfront as compared to above ground lines, as well as maybe in the long term whether they're cheaper to maintain once you get them underground. So those are my questions for each of you.
Okay. Is this on? Well, I'll speak loudly.
Oh, it is. Just get close to it.
So I think almost every time it hasn't happened in this one yet, but almost every conference I go to on energy, someone says, our problem is we don't have a national energy policy. And I'm not sure what to make of that because, one of the things, we're a capitalist system, and private sector actors make these investment decisions, right? Now, we could have a policy that tries to steer them in particular directions, and that's what we do, right? We do that in a variety of ways through regulation that makes one source more expensive than another, and so in a sense, we try to steer the private sector in that way, but it's always going to be the product of, at least at the top level, of congressional action, and that's always going to be political, and it's always going to be tinkered with, or not. I mean, there's never going to. So we have this ad hoc system that's a response to events, policy. Most of our energy and environmental policy is a response to this or that event. So the Exxon Valdez, we get the Oil Spill Prevention Act. The Cuyahoga River catches fire, we get the Clean Water Act, and so forth. We're always going to have those catalyzing events, and we're always going to have a Congress that wants to respond to them. And so it's hard for me to think of, at least at the congressional level, of there being ever being a national energy policy. And more specifically on the question of fracking, I've already written that I think it's best handled at the state level, so I'll stick with that.
Okay, so it's a very good question about underground versus overhead, and we're hearing more and more of it these days because of the reasons you cited, Hannah. I'll start with the estimated costs. The range is from about 6 times to 10 times as much going underground versus overhead. Obviously, if you're in a dense urban area like New York City, you're closer to the 10 times. But you don't have any choice in a place like New York City or Chicago or San Francisco. In rural communities and rural areas, it's closer to the lower end, maybe 5 to 6 times more. So how do you justify that cost? Well, obviously, we haven't justified it in many places other in the urban applications. However, There are new technologies, as I touched upon, that will actually help to bring those numbers down. If we implement DC, it's a lighter infrastructure than AC, so there's less to put under there to begin with. AC uses three-phase, DC uses two poles. To be very quite simple about it, you already have 1/3 less to put underneath. Also, less than 2% of our total transmission infrastructure in the U.S. is underground, so we haven't done that much of it. The more of it we do, the better we'll get at it, and that will drive the costs down. We'll be able to take advantage of economies of scale. We'll develop better methods for installation and operations of underground grids as we do more of it. The back end of it is, what about maintenance? What happens when you do have to maintain a facility? Obviously, overhead lines, it's easier to find faults and deal with them. You're above ground, you can get at things much easier. So it is more expensive when you have to go underground and maintain systems. However, you'll have many, many fewer problems in an underground network. It is not as susceptible or vulnerable to much of the natural events that occur and the reasons why we have a lot of outages to begin with. So our underground networks are actually much, much more reliable, so there'd be less maintenance to do. I think in the long run, the benefits of going underground will begin to far outweigh the costs when we look at this holistically and not just from an initial capital cost perspective.
Yes.
I was interested that neither of you really mentioned energy efficiency and managing the grid in a more efficient way as a substantial contributor to solving the problem. Is there a reason neither one of you mentioned it? You just don't believe it, or
no,
you didn't have time?
I believe it. I did, I think, indirectly address it through what we can do with existing transmission grids through I mentioned flexible AC transmission system technologies. Right now, about 40% of the overall capacity of the grid is underutilized in places where we don't have congestion. So how do we load up lines more that aren't loaded up right now? Again, I know not everybody's here as an engineer, but I think it's an example of why we need to be at the table together. Electricity takes the path of least resistance by nature. That's physics. If we don't do anything to change that, we'll continue to have congestion in places where the electricity wants to go and underutilization in places where it can't. So efficiency can be addressed in terms of implementing advanced technologies where we have control over the power flow itself. In most parts of the country, we really don't. But overall efficiency, is going to have its bigger gain at the end use side of it. And we're starting to see examples of that in places like California, where good energy efficiency and conservation measures are actually beginning to displace the amount of generation that's needed because demand is levelizing.
Yeah, I wouldn't want you to infer that I don't care about efficiency because I didn't mention it. So there's a lot of the smart grid is not really. A lot of the smart grid is the smart meter, but a lot of the smart grid is about using the grid more efficiently as well. So the incorporation of sort of intelligence into that aspect of grid usage, I think, is happening in lots of markets all around the country. Many people here are probably familiar with a McKinsey study that showed that there are tremendous opportunities in end-use efficiency that we could be taking advantage of, some of which are win-win opportunities, that is, they pay for themselves almost immediately, that we don't take advantage of because of various behavioral, inertia. We do a poor job of comparing immediate outlays against future streams of income and things like that. And there are lots of experiments at the local level, local government and PUC level, trying to get people to invest in some of these, easy opportunities, low-hanging fruit efficiency investments. In Austin, we have something called the Pecan Street Project, which is much of its work is dedicated to that very thing, trying to come up with ways to get people to realize these efficiency savings.
Yes.
I was just wondering, what changes should be made in the current maintenance practices of distribution companies to prepare for changes in both generation sources and load? And is there a blueprint available for the transition from the current practices?
Well, when you look at maintenance practices, I mean, utilities have been at this for decades and are actually pretty good at it. And there's probably no one blueprint. It's region by region, it's utility by utility, it's system by system. All of them are very unique. We've never standardized in this industry. So the different legacy infrastructure that's out there in different systems versus the generation of different vendor equipment over the decades. It changes from region to region and company to company. So there's certainly no blueprint. In terms of maintenance practices, it's something that the industry works on all the time to improve. Try to get the outage times down. How do you do that? A lot of it is predicated on the new smart grid technologies, where we have better monitoring and diagnostics, more visualization into the network, where when we have an outage, we can locate it, much better automatically now without having to send trucks out looking for things. So there are improvements that are taking place. In terms of the distribution system itself, again, as we start to build out infrastructure, replace new infrastructure, it's really a matter of upgrading it with these new technologies so that we have better insight to what's happening when it happens in real time. And I'd say that's probably the biggest thing. Today, we don't have as much real-time data and real-time insight as to what happens.
Are you thinking of, the fact that we have solar panels on rooftops and more electric cars, and that's more of an investment thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you'd have to invest in new infrastructure to be able to handle that additional load as a source, right?
That's right. And again, distribution systems have not had much load hanging off of them before. Distribution feeders don't have generation on it now. That's changing. It's changing dramatically. And, how do we handle that two-way flow that we never had before? So it is going to predicate changes on maintenance and operations and planning. One of the most difficult things in the utility industry today is, how do I plan future infrastructure? I don't know where the resources are coming from. It makes it very, very difficult. Not only that, utilities used to own generation, transmission, and the customer. Now they don't own anything but the wires primarily. So they don't even know where their bulk generation is going to come from, more so what the consumer might do. So it's a pretty big challenge.
We don't, unfortunately.
Okay.
We catch them during the break, I hope. We have one more panel, and then I believe we have a break after that, so stay tuned. Our
Thank you.
first break is at 10:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.